Dogs don't lie. Golden Retriever. Bella trembled every time they passed that house. Husky Max would prick up his ears and listen intently to what was happening inside. Margaret had been working with dogs for 40 years. Their behavior always told a story. And about this house, the dogs were right. What was happening inside triggered every alarm system from Margaret's former FBI training. But here's what the wealthy families of Beacon Hill didn't know about their quiet dog walker. Margaret Patterson wasn't just a harmless old woman who walked their pets for $15 an hour. She was a former FBI agent who had spent 25 years in the Domestic Terrorism Unit, infiltrating the most dangerous networks in America. And now, in the most exclusive neighborhood in Boston, she was about to uncover a secret that would shock even her. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we begin this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. Beacon Hill, Boston, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in America. Brownstone houses worth millions, where old money families lived behind perfectly manicured facades. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and outsiders were carefully screened. Margaret Patterson, 67 years old, had been walking dogs in this neighborhood for 8 years. Every morning at 8 a.m., she would begin her route with 6 different dogs from 6 different wealthy families. Reliable, quiet, invisible. The family saw her as exactly what she appeared to be, a working-class woman who needed the money. They paid her well enough to ensure loyalty, but never enough to suggest respect. She was the help, useful but unremarkable. Margaret had cultivated this image carefully. Simple clothes, humble demeanor, never speaking unless spoken to. She had learned that being underestimated was often the greatest advantage. But behind Margaret's calm exterior was a mind that had been trained to see patterns, to read behavior, to detect the hidden truths that others missed. 25 years with the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit had taught her that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in the most respectable places. Margaret's route took her past 8 houses, but she only walked dogs from 6 of them. The 7th house, the Westfield mansion, had always intrigued her. No pets, despite having 2 young children, the family kept to themselves, even by Beacon Hill standards. But the dogs she walked told her stories about that house. Bella, the golden retriever from next door, would slow down and whimper whenever they approached the Westfield property. Max, the husky from across the street, would stop and tilt his head, listening to sounds Margaret couldn't hear. Dogs were sensitive to tension, to fear, to violence. Margaret had learned this during her FBI years when she worked cases involving domestic terrorism cells that operated from suburban homes. The dogs were trying to tell her something. The Westfields appeared to be the perfect American family. Richard Westfield, 45, was a successful investment banker. His wife, Catherine, 42, was a former prosecutor who now did charity work. Their children, Emma, 8, and James, 10, attended the most exclusive private school in Boston. On the surface, they were everything Beacon Hill represented: wealth, education, social responsibility. But Margaret's trained eye began to notice inconsistencies. The children were never outside playing. In a neighborhood where kids rode bikes and played in small gardens, Emma and James were invisible. Catherine Westfield rarely left the house, and when she did, she wore long sleeves even in summer, sunglasses that covered more of her face than necessary. Richard's schedule was erratic, sometimes gone for days, sometimes home during business hours, pacing in front of windows with his phone pressed to his ear. 3 weeks into her observation, Margaret witnessed something that confirmed her suspicions. She was walking Bella past the Westfield house when she heard shouting from inside. Male voice, aggressive, angry. Then silence. Then a child crying, quickly muffled. Bella stopped walking and sat down, trembling. Margaret's FBI training kicked in immediately. Domestic violence had different patterns than domestic terrorism, but the signs were often similar: isolation, control, fear. She casually walked to the corner, pulled out her phone, and made a note. Time, date, observations, old habits. That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 8 years. She opened her laptop and began researching. Margaret Patterson had joined the FBI in 1978, one of the few women in the bureau at the time. She specialized in domestic terrorism, infiltrating groups that operated from suburban communities, appearing normal while planning attacks. Her specialty was what the bureau called deep cover suburban operations. She would pose as a neighbor, a worker, someone invisible. She learned that the most dangerous people often hid behind the most respectable facades. She had spent months infiltrating militia groups in Idaho, cults in Texas, terrorist cells in Michigan. Always as someone forgettable, someone who belonged but didn't stand out. Her cover was so effective that she had once spent 6 months living next door to a bomb-making operation, gradually building trust until she could gather enough evidence for arrests. The work had cost her personally. No husband, no children, no normal life. But she'd prevented dozens of attacks and saved hundreds of lives. She retired in 2003, moved to Boston, and tried to live quietly. But some instincts never retire. Margaret's research into the Westfield family revealed interesting patterns. Richard Westfield's business trips corresponded with spikes in certain investment activities. Catherine's former cases as a prosecutor had all involved domestic violence, until she suddenly stopped practicing law 5 years ago. The children had changed schools 3 times in 4 years, always with medical reasons listed for the transfers. Margaret began what she called passive surveillance. Using her dog walking as cover, she studied the family's routines. Richard's violence followed patterns, usually after business stress, usually late evening, always when the children were supposedly asleep. Catherine showed classic signs of long-term abuse, isolation, hypervigilance, protective behavior toward the children. But there was something else. Something that triggered Margaret's terrorism training rather than just her domestic violence awareness. Margaret noticed that Richard Westfield received visitors at unusual hours, men who didn't look like bankers, who parked down the street and approached on foot. She recognized the pattern from her FBI days, operational security measures, using her old bureau contacts, unofficially. Margaret learned that Richard Westfield was under investigation by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Suspected of money laundering for organizations the FBI wouldn't name over the phone. The pieces came together. Richard wasn't just an abusive husband. He was laundering money for dangerous people, using his respectable banker image as cover. Catherine wasn't just a battered wife. She was a former prosecutor who might have evidence that could destroy entire criminal networks. The children weren't just victims of domestic violence. They were leveraged to keep Catherine silent. The situation escalated when Margaret observed Richard becoming increasingly paranoid. More late-night visitors, more aggressive phone calls, more violence toward Catherine. The dog's behavior became more agitated. Bella wouldn't walk past the house at all. Max would growl softly whenever Richard appeared in the window. Then Margaret saw something that changed everything. While walking Max early one morning, Margaret saw Catherine in the garden, hanging laundry. As she reached up, her sleeve fell back, revealing not just bruises but what looked like burn marks in a distinctive pattern. Margaret had seen those marks before, during her FBI years. They were torture marks, used by criminal organizations to extract information or ensure silence. This wasn't domestic violence anymore. This was terrorism. Catherine was being tortured for information about her former cases or to ensure her silence about Richard's activities. Margaret made a decision. After 8 years of retirement, it was time to go back to work. Margaret couldn't go to local police. If Richard was connected to organized crime, there might be corruption in the department. She couldn't contact the FBI officially. She had no evidence that would stand up in court, and the children's safety was at immediate risk. She would have to handle this the way she had in her deep cover days, carefully, quietly, with no backup. Margaret began phase 1, gaining Catherine's trust. Margaret changed her routine slightly, walking past the Westfield house when Catherine was usually in the garden. "Beautiful roses," Margaret commented one morning, stopping with Bella. Catherine looked up, startled. She rarely spoke to neighbors. "Thank you," Catherine replied cautiously. "I used to grow roses," Margaret continued conversationally. "Takes patience and the right environment. Some places are too difficult for delicate things to thrive." Catherine stared at her. Margaret's tone was gentle, but her words carried weight. "Yes," Catherine said slowly. "Some environments are very difficult." Margaret nodded. "If you ever need advice about roses or anything else, I walk by here every day." She continued walking, leaving Catherine to process the coded message. 2 days later, Catherine was waiting in the garden when Margaret passed. "The roses are dying," Catherine said quietly. "I don't know how to save them." Margaret stopped. "Sometimes they need help, professional help, from someone who knows about difficult environments." Catherine's hands were shaking. "What if asking for help makes things worse?" "In my experience," Margaret said carefully, "things get worse on their own if nothing changes. But the right kind of help from the right person can save everything that matters." Catherine looked directly at her for the first time. "Are you the right person?" Margaret thought about her FBI training, her years of infiltrating dangerous situations, her expertise in protecting vulnerable people. "I might be." That evening, Catherine approached Margaret during her final walk. "The children's lives are in danger," Catherine whispered. "Not just from him, from people he works with. They're using us to control him and using him to control me." "What do they want?" Margaret asked. "Files from my prosecutor days, cases I sealed, information about witness protection, judge security, jury tampering operations." Margaret felt cold. This was bigger than domestic violence, bigger than money laundering. This was about compromising the entire justice system. "How long do we have?" Margaret asked. "They're coming tomorrow night. If I don't give them what they want—" Catherine didn't finish. Margaret squeezed her arm gently. "I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Catherine nodded. "Then here's what we're going to do." Margaret spent that night planning like she hadn't in 8 years. She contacted her former bureau partner through encrypted channels, arranging federal backup. The plan was simple: extract Catherine and the children safely while gathering evidence against Richard and his network. Margaret would use her cover as the invisible dog walker to coordinate the operation. The next evening, she began her final walk in Beacon Hill. At 8:47 p.m., Margaret walked past the Westfield house with Bella. She texted a simple message: "Go." Federal agents surrounded the house within minutes. Richard was arrested along with 3 associates who had come to collect the files. Catherine and the children were evacuated safely to witness protection. Margaret's testimony about her months of observation provided crucial evidence linking Richard to a network that had been compromising federal cases for years. The Boston Globe headline read, "FBI breaks up criminal network operating in Beacon Hill." Margaret's name was never mentioned in the reports, just as she preferred. She continued walking dogs in the neighborhood, but now families looked at her differently, with a respect they couldn't quite explain. Catherine sent her a single postcard from her new location. "The roses are blooming." 6 months later, Margaret was walking a new dog, a rescue pit bull named Justice, past where the Westfield house used to be. The new owners had planted a rose garden. Margaret smiled and continued her walk, knowing that sometimes the most important work happens in places where no one thinks to look. Dogs don't lie, and neither do the people who know how to listen to them. And so, in the most exclusive neighborhood in Boston, it was proven once again that appearances can be deceiving. A woman seen as just a dog walker was actually one of the FBI's most effective undercover agents. But more importantly, She was someone who never forgot that protecting the innocent was worth coming out of retirement. Real protectors are like this. They watch quietly, notice what others miss, and act when action is needed most. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe stories like this should continue to be told, support Echo Stories by subscribing. See you in the next video. And remember, that quiet person walking dogs in your neighborhood might be watching over more than just pets. Everyone has a story, and that story deserves respect.